Another really interesting fact with this discussion, the David Betts discussion that I wanted to pick up on, was the concept of government legitimacy. Now, government legitimacy is one of those terms you've heard, but I'd never really understood clearly what it was, and he explains it very well. Basically, government legitimacy is the inverse of the cost to govern. So when legitimacy is very high, people have a belief that the government has a right to rule, and it's all based in consent rather than force, effectively. So if government legitimacy is high, people are paying their taxes, people are obeying the rules. Whenever you turn your back, you know that people will generally do the right thing because they just want to, because they believe that the system is legitimate. The cost of policing a system like that is very low. If government legitimacy is very low and people do not believe that the state is legitimate and what they're doing is legitimate, then the cost of policing is very high, because the moment you turn your back now, people will not do what the state wants them to do and will probably get up to no good as far as the state is concerned at every opportunity, because they consider the state to be illegitimate and they don't like them. So that was a fascinating way of looking at what government legitimacy is. I'm going to pull out a quote from Max Weber on a paper called Economy and Security, in which he says, legitimacy is the foundation of government power. It is exercised both with a consciousness on the government's part that it has a right to govern, and with some recognition by the governed of that right. Government legitimacy is extremely low these days. I don't think anybody who watches Lotus Eaters believes that the government of the UK is legitimate. It's got to the point where I saw a really good tweet from Douglas Carswell in which he said, "I don't want a new government, I want a new state." Meaning that he doesn't want the political party changed. He wants the entire mechanism and apparatus of the state to be replaced by a new one. And that's where we are. We have a state which is widely considered, and more widely considered, to be illegitimate. And the amount of people who come to that conclusion, the British state is illegitimate, is just going to climb and climb from here. So the inverse of government legitimacy is cost of governance, cost to police. Apparently, the government spent 100 million on the 2024 Southport riots, but then 95% of people are paying their taxes, so it's still up there. They're high enough. So we're failing on this one. Let me phrase it like this. Let me phrase it like this. I've mentioned the Frank Zappa quote that I really like in my segments a number of times. The Frank Zappa quote is, "The illusion of freedom will continue as long as it's profitable to continue the illusion. At the point where the illusion becomes too expensive to maintain, they will just take down the scenery, they will pull back the curtains, they will move the tables and chairs out of the way, and you will see the brick wall at the back of the theatre." Basically saying is that there is no freedom, there's no democracy, it's all an illusion, and if it's at the point where it becomes cheaper just to rule through brute force, they just do that instead. And I think that is essentially correct. The way that policing is done, the way that the state operates, it's done that way because it is cheaper to make you believe that the state is legitimate than to just rule through naked force. I would point out that the police are not there to defend you from criminals. The police are there to defend the government from you. And I do believe that at the moment that the state thinks that it needs to team up with criminals against you in order to save themselves, they will do that in a heartbeat. And many countries in history have done exactly that. The government has teamed up with literal criminals against their own people. Well, the government are literal criminals. They're just the most successful criminal gang in the country. But the way the system works is they pretend to be on the people's side. They pretend to offer police force that go out and solve burglaries and murders and all that kind of stuff. They're not doing it because it's actually important to them. The reason they're doing that is because if they can make you believe that this state apparatus is being run on your behalf, you are more likely to go along with it. You're more likely to voluntarily pay your taxes. You're more likely to obey their rules. And therefore, if they can maintain this illusion, it's simply cheaper to make you think that the state is there for your benefit as opposed to theirs. Yeah, effectively what I'm saying is the stuff that they do that looks like it's benefiting you, streetlights, police hunting burglars, firefighters, all of that is done because it's easier to make you pay taxes that way, to make you think that you're bought into it. I would add that if you go through the budget of the British government, things like police are listed under state protection, not citizen protection, not protection of justice. Police are listed as state protection, and they are state protection. I can guarantee that if there was ever a situation where your little old grandma was about to be beaten up and burgled, or somebody was going to make Keir Starmer feel slightly uncomfortable, or the money centres, and there was only one policeman available, that one policeman would be sent to the money powers or Keir Starmer, not your little old grandmother. So legitimacy has been eroding quite significantly. Worryingly, the government doesn't seem to be aware of the scale of the problem. It hasn't noticed that there's Labour have now made some reference to the fact that the borders are wide open. Although Labour are unwilling to admit that it's got a problem with child protection. And people are looking at this and thinking, well, you're not doing your job. Well, actually, they are doing their job. What they're not doing is the illusion element of this. So the costs of governing is going up, but they've spent years pushing down the depth of those things like police. If you're in a medium-sized British town, I once got talking to an officer in a medium-sized British town on a Saturday night, and I said, okay, well, how good is the depth of coverage? And he said, oh, it's basically me and a couple of other guys on shift and available to respond. So that would have been a town of about 60,000 people, and they had 3 officers available to do police stuff. So there's very, very little police capacity in this country, and if people started to disobey, or government legitimacy dropped to the point where people actively did the wrong thing, that capacity would just be used up in an absolute instance. Okay, so relating this back to civil wars, apparently Barbara Walters' research pointed out, I think it was 70% of civil wars, have followed legitimacy crises. I saw that the Syrian civil war with Assad immediately was preceded by a loss of the perception of legitimacy, and trust fell down to something like 20%, and that is 20% is above where Keir Starmer is today at the moment. So yes, legitimacy is done. The other thing you got to bear in mind is in the UK is the government is actively opposing its own citizens with globalist policies. The open borders, the corporate interests are probably the most clear things. We had the lockdown scandal, and the big firms were allowed to stay open while the small ones were closed. The borders stayed open while we had to apparently be locked up at home. It's quite clear that globalist interests have never been harmed, but native interests always have been harmed. You've got the Tony Blair Institute, a globalist think tank, which is increasingly powerful, which is pushing a lot of this stuff, not just here, but in many other places. The elites see it as globalization is progress, open borders, free trade, whereas the rest of us kind of see it as being abandoned and having our interests sort of aggressively attacked. On borders, in the past few years, we've seen over 1 million immigrants per year. I think in the last year that we've got the full figures for, 1.2 million people came into the country. The other side of the ledger was the last Tory government had this pretend Rwanda scheme where they were going to deport people to Rwanda, and they never did. They spent 320 million on it, and it delivered nothing. It was an illusion tactic to make you not feel so bad about the levels of immigrants, because they were going to be doing something. Well, they never were. It was all a deception. We're still in the ECHR, the European Court of Human Rights, which is stopping us from doing anything to address any of this. And again, none of that has changed. The new incoming Labour government has just said, yeah, we're staying in the ECHR. They're not even pretending to leave it like the Tories were. And they're not going to even pretend to do the Rwanda stuff. Yep, not good. So it almost feels like that the British government has pulled together the best minds of its generation to come up with a plan to destroy government legitimacy as fast as it possibly can. It's difficult to imagine, if you were doing this deliberately, that you could do a better job than the UK government is currently doing of demolishing the social contract. The social capital, the government legitimacy is all being destroyed at the moment.
If you would like to see the full version of this premium video, please head over to lotuseaters.com and subscribe to gain full access to all of our premium content.